Good evening, everyone. Time for another silver update. Now, this is the 5-minute chart of silver provided by netdandia.com. You can click on the link below. Now, the big question is going to be, is this the bottom? If you remember, I initially made the call for a test of 15. Based on these volume patterns, I would have to say that we have not seen the bottom yet. If this were a bottom, which it very well could be, especially based upon this action here, this move from 1685, 1686 up to 1715, a good 30-cent move or so on pretty big volume. And if this would have continued and gone something like this, let's say, then I would be fairly certain, maybe 80 or 90% certain, that a bottom was in place. But with this action, after this volume came in, you can see the volume peaked right here and then has come down as we sell off. So that tells me the bottom isn't in yet. So for those of you who still have dry powder, now a lot of the coins that I was looking at are starting to evaporate. The other thing that I've noticed on APMEX and to some extent the other sites, as people have pointed out on the blog, or I'm sorry, on the member site, that APMEX and some of the others have stopped lowering their prices. Now that's not surprising. I have in the past, I believe, I'm not certain of this, but I believe that I have been able to purchase certain coins from APMEX for below what they paid for them. But it appears to me that this time they're not willing to sell for a loss, basically. If they're going to have to sell it for something less than they paid for it, then they're probably willing to just leave the price a little bit higher and just not bring the prices down. So that's what we're seeing. Now, this is not something that's new. I've pointed out before, if you were watching the price of Silver Eagles during 2008, from that move of about $21, let's just pull it up here. From the move of about $21 down to about $8.50 during this time frame, I did not see the price of Silver Eagles go below $16. So you can see that it spent a considerable period of time below, let's say, 15. But during this entire time frame, I did not see Silver Eagles go below 16. So obviously, at one point here, that we were talking about an 100% premium, or nearly 100% premium on the price of the coins. Are we going to repeat that? We could, and then that's just a matter of watching inventories and seeing if you can find a deal. Now, in the past, when we've had violent sell-offs and then kind of falling off here, you've got one here where we had this violent sell-off and then kind of a drift lower. You can see a tightening up where they actually do come closer. They don't bring their prices down initially, but then as things continue falling, they bring their prices down. So that's something to watch. I don't think the bottom's in yet, but the prices could drift lower as things consolidate. We just have to wait and see what happens with the prices. Now, I wanted to look at what's going on in the currencies because it's very, very dramatic. Of course, we've got the euro, and that's going significantly lower again tonight. We'll have to wait a second here while we get back online. But the euro is going significantly lower tonight, as well as the British pound is going significantly lower tonight, and the Japanese yen is going significantly lower tonight, and the US dollar Swiss franc is also going significantly lower. So that is causing, let's look at those now that it's come back here. That is causing the dollar index to absolutely explode. This is the daily of the Japanese yen. So you can see that breakout, and if we go to the 1 minute, it's just continuing. Sorry about that, the charts are acting wonky right now. So we'll look, here's the Swiss franc. Again, a huge bump. The British pound, I'm sorry, that's British pound, Japanese yen. The British pound rolled over back in here, and you can see we're rolling over again. So all of this put together is a big boost in the dollar index. This is the action today. You can see a huge move, and then we're finishing up tonight. If we go out further and look at the bigger picture here, you can see the rally goes back to basically the beginning of August, a move from around 81 on the dollar index all the way up to 86. So maybe going up towards a 10% move when this thing is said and done. It's starting to look to me like this rally is kind of going to peter out. And the MACD, you can see the extreme overbought condition on the MACD here. It looks like this thing is topping out. Now, the first question everybody asks is, why is this occurring? Well, it's occurring obviously because we're seeing weakness in the other currencies in the basket, specifically weakness in the yen, weakness in the euro, weakness in the pound, and weakness in the Swiss franc. Now, why is that occurring? The other currency we want to look at, the one that hasn't really been affected, and in my mind, probably the most important, is going to be the US-Chinese cross. And that had the bounce that I've talked about for quite some time, and that's this bounce here. We can see it better when we get out to the weekly. And I said that this would be a dead cat bounce, and we would turn around and go back down. Now, we're stalling in that down. We're about halfway back down. But again, no real activity in the dollar versus Chinese currency. So again, why is this happening? Well, I want to take you to this article here, and this is something that I've been suspecting. China accuses the U.S. of fomenting Hong Kong unrest. I'm going to read a little bit of this. This is from Washington's blog. The mass demonstrations in Hong Kong are dramatic indeed, and given that Hong Kong has enjoyed a more liberal existence under British rule, protests against a more authoritarian Chinese government are not entirely surprising. But Chinese officials accuse U.S. of egging on the protests, as the Wall Street Journal's China Real-Time blog reports. On Thursday, Wen Wei Po published an expose into what is described as the U.S. connections to Joshua Wong, a 17-year-old leader of the student group Scholarism. The story asserts that U.S. forces identified Mr. Wong's potential 3 years ago and have worked since then to cultivate him as a political superstar. Evidence for Mr. Wong's close ties to the U.S. that the paper cited included what the report described as frequent meetings with U.S. consulate personnel in Hong Kong and covert donations from Americans to Mr. Wong. As evidence, the paper cited photographs leaked by netizens. The story also said Mr. Wong's family visited Macau in 2011 at the invitation of the American Chamber of Commerce, where they stayed at a U.S.-owned Venetian Macau, which is owned by Las Vegas Sands Corporation. And it goes on. So I've covered this before with the video I did on color revolutions in the Ukraine. And yes, it's been my opinion, I agree with Dave of the X22 report, that the U.S. is involved in fomenting unrest all around the world. But now the unrest seems to be either economic weakness in Europe, Japan, or actual color revolutions around the world, attacks against Russia and China. And this seems to be causing strength to come into the US dollar. Now, how long will that last? How long will destabilization or unrest around the world and other parts of the world cause investors to flock to the dollar? I can't answer that question, but I definitely believe that there's something to that. Now, I'm not going to finish up the Council on National Policy, the CNP, but let's suffice it to say that I was practically done with that video. But this group, whether it's a group that's on the far right or whether it's a group that's on the far left, both of these groups do not believe in the Constitution. They've been working to undermine the Constitution, one coming from communist Marxist perspective, socialist totalitarian, another one coming from a fascist neocon perspective, totalitarian. Neither one is a classical liberal. Neither one is supporting the belief in individual rights and the Constitution. So both of these groups of people on the far left, whether that be Soros and that crowd and Buffett and all those, or whether it's the far right with this CNP and that crowd, the neocons, the one thing that these groups seem to have in common is that they believe in undermining the Constitution and your rights, and even undermining free markets. All of the things that we believe in, I believe in, they believe in undermining those, and they're very powerful on the right and they're very powerful on the left. Now, this is the reason I believe that the U.S. government is engaged in this activity. This is a article, and I'm going to read most of it from the Economic Collapse blog. And as you know, today is the 30th of September. This is the end of the fiscal year. This is when, once we begin checking the national debt figures going forward through October, this is traditionally when we've seen these numbers jump really, really fast. We'll watch them closely and see if they jump really, really fast here. They don't have the traditional debt ceiling that they've had in the past, so they pretty much have free reign until March 15th of next year. What's going to happen March 15th of next year? No one knows. At least no one is talking. That's when this suspension, and that's what they did, they suspended the debt limit. That's when it's going to come back into effect. What will the limit be? I don't think anyone knows the answer to that. So let's read this. This, I believe, is the reason why the U.S. is doing things overseas to try to force people back to the dollar. U.S. government is borrowing about $8 trillion a year. I know that headline sounds completely outrageous, but it is actually true. The U.S. government is borrowing about $8 trillion a year, and you're about to see the hard numbers that prove this. When discussing the national debt, most people tend to only focus on the amount that it increases each 12 months, and that's the figure that I've been checking. And as I wrote recently, the U.S. national debt has increased by more than $1 trillion in fiscal year 2014, but that does not count the huge amounts of U.S. Treasury securities that the federal government must redeem each year. When these debt instruments hit their maturity date, the U.S. government must pay them off. This is done by borrowing more money to pay off the previous debts. In fiscal year 2013, redemptions of U.S. Treasury securities totaled $7.5 trillion, and new debt totaling $8.3 trillion was issued. The final numbers for fiscal year 2014 are likely to be significantly higher than that. So why does so much of the government debt come due each year? Well, in recent years, government officials figured out that they could save a lot of money on interest payments by borrowing over shorter time frames. For example, it costs the government far more to borrow money for 10 years than it does for 1 year. So this gives the explanation, and I've talked about this before. They began rolling the national debt over into short-term treasuries. Now, even with the 10-year note at 2.5% or so, they consider that too high when they can get ridiculously low rates of near 0% on the short term. But what that causes is, as they begin to roll into the short-term debt, a larger and larger number comes up more frequently that has to be refinanced. And that's not a big deal either, as long as the short-term interest rates are very, very low. But what happens if there's a spike? Then they've set themselves up for a catastrophic collapse. An analogy that you could use on that is, if you think about the people who rolled out of the by the way, at Alan Greenspan's recommendation, the people who rolled out of the 30-year fixed rate mortgage loans and went into the ARMs, the adjustable rate mortgages that moved with interest rates. And of course, Alan Greenspan encouraged people because they could save money on their monthly payment. What happened? Interest rates went up suddenly. Those ARMs went up suddenly. The interest rates exploded. Their mortgage payments doubled and tripled, and the people lost their houses. That happened very quickly, and it was catastrophic. That is what the Treasury and the government is setting us up for. If rates ever rise, it's going to be catastrophic. Now, I want to get down to the reasons why things are so bad and why they have to keep this thing going. In the United States today, we have a heavily socialized system that hands out checks to nearly half the population. In fact, 49% of all Americans live in a home that gets direct monetary benefits from the federal government each month, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. And it is hard to believe, but Americans receive more than $2 trillion in benefits from the federal government last year alone. At this point, the primary function of the federal government is taking money from some people and giving it to others. Let that sink in. That's the point I've been making. We only pay enough taxes now just to cover the transfer payments. There is no money left to actually run any functions of the government. And that includes all of the military, all of the federal workers' pay, and all of the departments of the government. In fact, more than 70% of all federal spending goes to dependence creating programs. And the government runs approximately 80 different means-tested welfare programs right now. But the big problem is that the government is giving out far more money than it is taking in, so it has to borrow the difference. As long as we can continue to grow at super low interest rates, the status quo can continue. But a Ponzi scheme like this can only last for so long. It has been said that when the checks stop coming in, chaos will begin in the streets of America. The looting that took place when a technical glitch caused the EBT system to go down for a short time in some areas last year, and the rioting in the streets of Ferguson, Missouri this year were both small previews of what we will see in the future. And there is no way we will be able to grow our way out of this problem. As the baby boomers continue to retire, the amount of money that the federal government is handing out each year is projected to absolutely skyrocket. Just consider the following numbers. Back in 1965, only 1 out of every 50 Americans was on Medicaid. Today, more than 70 million Americans are on Medicaid, and it is being projected that Obamacare will add 16 million more Americans to the Medicaid rolls. When Medicare was first established, we were told that it would cost about $12 billion a year by the time 1990 rolled around. Instead, the federal government ended up spending $110 billion on the program in 1990, and the federal government spent approximately $600 billion on the program in 2013. It is being projected that the number of Americans on Medicare will grow from 50.7 million in 2012 to 73.2 million in 2025. At this point, Medicare is facing unfunded liabilities of more than $38 trillion over the next 75 years. In 1945, there were 42 workers for every retiree receiving Social Security benefits. Today, that number has fallen to 2.5 workers, and if you eliminate all government workers, that leaves only 1.6 private sector workers for every retiree receiving Social Security benefits. And it goes on and on and on. So those are the frightening facts. There's no question that a collapse has to come. It's either going to come through a complete default wipeout or it's going to come through hyperinflation. At the present time, the government is concerned with propping up the dollar. I believe that they are trying to destabilize the rest of the nations of the world to cause money to flow to the United States, strengthen the currency, prevent this inevitable collapse. Will this work in the short term? Yeah, I think it's working. And as the dollar is strengthening, of course, the precious metals are weakening. And this is how you're seeing this incredible buying opportunity come into the precious metals. As far as the bottom, again, I don't think this is the bottom for silver. The volume patterns don't show that to me. I haven't seen the kind of volume come in, although the volume has been massive. If we pull out to the 30 minutes, actually, let's go out to the 2 hour. If we pull out to the 2 hour, you can see a fairly large crescendo coming in volume. But what came in today, you can see right there, still a very large amount of volume. Are we going to get some massive volume spike all the way up into here to give us that 15 bottom? We very well could, and that would be the time to back up the truck. And we'll talk to you next time.